Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Simon Fitzpatrick. I'm the current holder of the Don Shula Chair in Philosophy at John Carroll. And I'm delighted to welcome you here to the annual Don Shula Lecture for 2021. A different format to the one we're usually used to, but hopefully it's going to work out okay. The Don Shula Chair was endowed by JCU graduate of the class of 1951, the late great Don Shula, who's legendary former head coach of the Miami Dolphins, a team that Shula coached to 2 Super Bowl victories and the only Super Bowl winning perfect season in the history of the NFL. Don Shula was a philosophy student at John Carroll University and was so impacted by the philosophical education that he received at John Carroll that he created the Shula Chair in Philosophy, which is intended to further enhance the study of philosophy as a shaping experience for undergraduate students and to promote awareness and understanding of philosophy and important philosophical issues on the John Carroll campus and in the wider Cleveland area community. It does this through lectures, seminars, faculty research, the Philosophy for Kids program, and related activities, including this annual lecture series. So today I'm delighted to welcome you to a discussion of a philosophical issue of considerable current significance, the ethics of captivity, featuring Professor Laurie Gruen from Wesleyan University. Professor Gruen has a BA in philosophy and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Colorado, Boulder. And she is William Griffin Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Feminist, Gender and Sexuality Studies and Science in Society, and coordinator of the Animal Studies program at Wesleyan University. Professor Gruen is known for her work in practical ethics and political philosophy, though perhaps most well known for her writings on ethical issues relating to our treatment of and relations with non-human animals. Professor Gruen has described her work as focusing in particular on issues impacting those often overlooked in traditional ethical discussions, such as women, people of color, incarcerated people, and non-human animals. She's the author or editor of numerous books, including Ethics and Animals, an Introduction, Critical Terms for Animal Studies, Reflecting on Nature, Readings in Environmental Philosophy and Ethics, The Ethics of Captivity, and Entangled Empathy. Professor Gruen is a fellow of the Hastings Center for Bioethics, a faculty fellow at the Tufts Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine Center for Animals and Public Policy, and was the first chair of the Faculty Advisory Committee of the Center for Prison Education at Wesleyan University. And amongst a variety of different kinds of activism and public advocacy work, Professor Gruen has been a notable advocate for captive chimpanzees who have been involved in biomedical research in the United States, and has documented the history of the first 100 chimpanzees who were used in research in the US at the website, The First 100 Chimps. She has also created a website, The Last 1,000 Chimps, that tracks those chimpanzees remaining in biological research laboratories in the US as they are hopefully retired and moved to sanctuaries. So we're delighted to have Professor Gruen here this afternoon to deliver the 2021 Shula Lecture. So we will have a Q&A session after the lecture. If you have questions for Professor Gruen, you can put them in the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you and you can speak through the video and the microphone. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Professor Gruen. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thanks for that very kind introduction. I'm very honored to be here. And as you mentioned, I do have quite a bit of involvement with captive chimpanzees, as you see on the screen. This is a picture of a chimpanzee, a young chimpanzee named Mel. And Mel isn't in a laboratory or a zoo. She's actually in a sanctuary in Florida. And I like to use this image in part because I think that the idea of captivity evokes a variety of different notions in people's minds. And here, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, this is a chimpanzee in sanctuary. You would think this is a chimpanzee in a laboratory. But if you notice carefully, the wire along the in the enclosure is very clean, which is pretty unusual. And the other thing I wanted to note about this is that even though Mel is right here in our face, looking at us, she's able to go out onto a large, over an acre enclosure with a variety of other chimpanzees. And so part of the reason I, again, like to show this is to sort of raise the question of, is there something wrong with captivity? Is there something that this image evokes that makes us question whether or not this is a good or a bad situation for this individual chimpanzee named Mel? I began thinking about the ethics of captivity after spending quite a bit of time with captive chimpanzees and other animals that are in sanctuaries, and also after teaching philosophy in prison that I've been doing for over 15 years. And so I'm going to talk about both of these areas of captivity in my discussion today. Of course, there's a variety of different ways in which individuals of our own species or other species are held in captivity. There's an estimated 7 million people in some form of captivity or captive control in the United States. By captive control, I mean parole, probation, detention, or pretrial holding. That's before they're sentenced. And then there's 2.3 roughly million people who are in prisons and jails around the country. 1 in 9 Black men will be incarcerated at some point in their lives. Of course, billions of animals are held captive and then killed in global food systems. It's estimated that about 25 million animals are in laboratories in the United States. There's about 800,000 in zoos in the US, and thousands of animals in other captive conditions. And the traditional resources within philosophy don't really allow us to think about the nuances of the ethics of captivity. So as Simon mentioned, a number of years ago, I put together this volume on the ethics of captivity. It was published by Oxford University Press. And the first part of the book offers perspectives from a variety of people who have some kind of expertise on captive conditions. That includes both humans and non-humans. And then the second part of the book provides philosophical reflections on captivity in general. And today, what I want to talk to you about are the harms of captivity. And there are many harms. Some of those are obvious, some are not so obvious. And I think one of the things that thinking about these harms in a more textured or nuanced way will allow us to do is to ask a question about whether and under what conditions we might be justified in holding humans and non-humans captive. So first, let's start by talking about what it is to be a captive. I've tried to do this in a fairly philosophical way, to think about what it means to hold somebody captive, and that is to deny the captive a variety of goods and to frustrate her interests in a number of ways. But it's also, and I think this is really the important concept that I want us to sort of think about throughout the discussion, it's a condition of being confined and controlled. That is, being locked away without access or possibility of leaving. And this control also means that the captive relies on others to satisfy their basic needs. That's what I'm going to mean by a captive in the rest of the discussion today. Now, I think it's important to keep very clearly in mind that being captive, even if this captive is having his or her or their basic needs met, that they're subjected to a variety of harms. And some of these harms we can think of as just your sort of typical understanding of suffering. So let's use the case of non-humans here. It's a little less complicated. That non-human animals may experience all variety of physical injury or physical pain in captivity. That would include injuries from either the humans who are keeping them under control, or it could be injury from conspecifics, that is other animals that they may be confined with. In laboratory conditions, you might have anesthesia, surgery, recovery. These are the kinds of things that actually do cause suffering, although they're very rarely discussed. It's a feature of, certainly a regular feature of laboratory life, but it's also a feature of other forms of captivity, including zoos as well as sanctuaries. And of course, the idea that an animal is subjected to a surgery, which may be necessary, they may need that surgery to get well, the chances that they understand that this is something that is for their well-being is, I think, an open question, whether or not that's something they can understand. So they're going to experience that intervention as a kind of physical pain. And of course, I'm not going to go into the details, but it's very clear by all of the scientific literature that animals indeed do feel physical pain. That's a whole argument that one could have, but I will sidestep that for now. There's also negative training techniques that are used that could include hooks, whips, electric shocks. And these are the kinds of things that animals that are captive may experience in the context of entertainment industry, in the context of experimentation, not in the context of sanctuaries. At least good sanctuaries would never use negative or aversive training techniques. They would only use positive training techniques that would not include physical pain. Of course, there's the problem of restraint, which can also cause significant suffering on the part of captive animals. And importantly, there's psychological suffering, and that can be exposure to artificial light if you're a creature that likes darkness, all sorts of other kinds of mechanical and perhaps human sounds that may be hard for other animals, particularly animals that have a heightened or sensitive sense of hearing. Of course, boredom and frustration are a very significant problem for animals in captivity, and you see a certain kind of regular stereotypy. For example, in certain conditions, maybe in a zoo, you've seen this, where an animal will be rocking back and forth because they are bored or frustrated. Many animals who are in captivity lack socialization. They're confined alone. That can also happen in zoos. It can happen in laboratories. Or there could be too much socialization. I did a visit to a primate laboratory a number of years ago, and there were just huge number of cages in one room, and they had many macaque monkeys in each cage, and there was no escape. So it was a huge cacophonous anxiety producing environment. So almost like there was too much socialization. And of course, the psychological suffering can also have to do with a lack of enrichment, a lack of stimulation, a lack of something to do with one's mind. And this is also related to the kind of boredom that animals might experience. Now, all of this suffering that I've mentioned, and I've just sort of very briefly touched on it, all of this suffering does matter from an ethical point of view. Our traditional ethical theories are concerned about the suffering of others, particularly theories like consequentialist theories, utilitarian theories that hold that what one ought to do is to minimize suffering. At least that's a minimum idea of what it is to do. So in thinking about the harms of captivity, there is a way in which our theories, our traditional ethical theories, are able to account for some of what's wrong with captivity if this suffering occurs. So I want you to hold on to that thought. I do, however, want to also mention the suffering of humans in captivity and share with you this quote from 5 of the men who I've taught in prison, who wrote a chapter for the Ethics of Captivity volume. These guys are they've been sentenced to a combined total of 225 years in prison, which is a very, very long time, of course. And I just wanted to share with you some of the kinds of suffering that you might not be familiar with from inside prisons. So they write, after our initial humiliation, upon being strip searched when we enter prison, we lose all control of our lives. And again, this control is part of what I think is a necessary condition for understanding what it is to be captive. They will eat, bathe, and shave when they're told. They're expected to follow direct orders, no matter how absurd or unfair. Non-compliance will be met with force. The depressive environment tends to stifle intellectual curiosity. They simply become too tired and sullen to engage in intellectual pursuits. Simply put, they dwell in their cells, they're not actively using their minds, and in a very real sense, they're thus losing their minds. The loneliness caused by prison in general and prison cells in particular is exacerbated by the loss of intimacy and the loving touch of friends and family. So captivity for both humans and for non-humans causes physical and psychological suffering. In these COVID times, this suffering is exacerbated both by the actual contraction of the virus. It's been particularly difficult within prison contexts that the COVID has, as we know, also in nursing homes and meatpacking plants, that those are particular hotspots for the spread of the COVID virus. I just heard today that 2 lions in a zoo also have been exposed to the virus. There's been gorillas who have been exposed to the virus and tigers that have been exposed to the virus. So being a captive in conditions of pandemics also creates heightened vulnerability to a kind of harm that one would experience having exposure to the virus. In the case of prisoners, there also is a tremendous heightened fear of being exposed to the virus, since there's no way they can go anywhere. And again, they're reliant on the institution to provide them with PPE when sometimes that's available and sometimes that's not available. And of course, we know that many have been sick. Many people who are incarcerated have been sickened by the virus, and many have also died from COVID. In addition, their mobility has been limited because they're not able to have the kind of typical programming that you might have in any given prison. They're limiting movement, they're limiting visitors. So conditions under the pandemic have created even more psychological suffering in addition to fear and actual illness. So I said that suffering is the kind of problem, ethical concern, that our more traditional ethical theories have been able to help us to think about and deal with. But one of the things that I think may not be as useful, and this is a conversation that I actually had with Peter Singer, who's a very well-known consequentialist who is concerned about the minimization of suffering, and that is he could easily imagine captive conditions in which there was no suffering, and there wouldn't be anything wrong with captivity in that context, because there wouldn't be suffering. You can imagine a case of captivity where there wasn't suffering. That might make it so that there's nothing ethically problematic about holding another captive. So I think the next thing that's important to think about is what is denied when one is captive beyond the imposition of a certain kind of suffering. And so this is a question about the value of freedom. And we want to ask a further question: why might denying an individual their freedom constitute a concern from an ethical point of view? Why might captivity or the denial of freedom be ethically troubling? And if you think about freedom or liberty, I'm using these interchangeably for present purposes. If you think about the value of freedom as being an instrumental value, that is, that it is the kind of thing that you value because it's conducive to achieving other things that are valuable, like pleasure or well-being, again, the avoidance of suffering, then it makes sense to think that, well, if there's captivity and you're not being able to make the certain kinds of choices that would lead you to a good life, as it were, or to satisfy your preferences, things that would make your life go better, well, then that would cause, you might say, a kind of frustration that, again, a consequentialist thinker, a thinker who's interested in maximizing well-being, would want to say, well, right, that's going to constitute a problem from the point of view of consequentialist ethical theory. And that, I think, gives us a little bit of play. The other idea here is that there is a sense in which, for many animals, non-human animals, really only would value liberty or their freedom insofar as it was an instrumental value, that they have an instrumental interest in liberty. That is, they're not really interested in liberty per se, the idea goes, that they're rather interested in doing the kinds of things that will lead to their satisfaction or contentment, or not lead to or preclude their frustration. And so even if animals make bad choices, I don't know who's here or if anybody lives with dogs, but I do. I live with dogs, and my dogs make really bad choices all the time in terms of what they would eat. But so you might think I should intervene in their freedom so they don't make those bad choices. But ultimately, we all make bad choices at different times. And it's part of a process of trial and error and learning. And it allows us to figure out what our interests might be. And so we might have a value in our instrumental value of our freedom, even if it leads to sort of feeling a tummy ache or feeling sick at a particular point. It's still valuable because it allows us ultimately, or other things being equal, to promote our well-being. But I think there's another way of thinking about the value of freedom. And this is the notion that freedom is not simply conducive, although it is conducive, to our getting the kinds of things we want, our preferences, our interests satisfied, but it's also constitutive of what it means to live a good life. And so one of the ideas here is that if liberty or freedom is valuable, and it's valuable intrinsically, what that actually means is that you have to recognize the importance of autonomy, because autonomy is the thing that intrinsic liberty interests protect and promotes. And this here now shows how we might have to part ways with a consequentialist or utilitarian way of thinking about ethics, because from that point of view, autonomy or freedom in itself isn't valuable. In fact, nothing really in itself is valuable other than a certain kind of conglomeration or maximization of well-being or minimization of suffering. So here we might be getting into the idea of a more rights-based or a more Kantian or deontological understanding of what might be at stake when we're thinking about captivity. And I think that there are importantly three ways of thinking about autonomy that I want to identify and discuss. So one of these ways is what we might call conceptual autonomy. And conceptual autonomy is this idea that you could have your own conception of what would constitute a good life for you. And you will revise that conception as you get new information or as you get older or as new desires emerge. And you will then pursue another conception. So you might have come to college thinking you want to maybe be pre-med, but then you take a philosophy course and you think, oh yeah, actually philosophy is really a much more interesting way of pursuing my goals. And so you might make a conceptual distinction between, okay, I thought I wanted to be in medicine, but now I think I want to do this other thing. Now, all of that requires that you can conceptualize. And certainly people who are incarcerated can conceptualize, but it's not at all clear that animals can do this, whether animals have a kind of capacity to form concepts, to change those concepts. There's a lot of interesting literature that's been developing around whether and which animals can do this. But for now, I'm gonna side with the skeptics and think, yeah, conceptualization is a little too high a bar for most other animals. There's another kind of notion of autonomy, and this comes directly from philosopher Immanuel Kant. To be autonomous is to be an individual who can reflect on their desires and their motives and decide whether or not they want to elevate those desires or motives to become universal, to recognize the normativity, if you will, of those desires and motives. It's a type of conceptual autonomy. It's much more specific. It's a very specific kind of conceptual autonomy, where what's at stake here is really whether or not you can depersonalize, I guess, your desires, see them as valuable for anybody who might be similarly situated, and recognize the power of those desires as a reason to act. That would be one way of understanding Kantian autonomy. This is really clear to me that no animal has this conception of autonomy. I'm kind of sure most of my own students don't have this, because I don't know if I have this conception of autonomy. So in any event, this is a really high bar of autonomy. It helps us to understand perhaps some people who might suffer in prisons, but it doesn't help us understand at all what might be wrong with animal captivity. So there's a third conception that I want to argue for, and it's what I'm calling, and it's a very clunky way of thinking about it. It's called relational agential autonomy. And what I have in mind by relational agential autonomy is a kind of autonomy that one has when one independently recognizes themselves as distinct from others, but in relation to others, and one can adapt their actions or change their actions based on the actions of others and the environment. It's a much more fundamental, I would say, conception of autonomy. But one of the things that I think is important about this conception of autonomy is it captures something about the freedom that animals have when they're making certain kinds of choices and decisions to act. It doesn't seem that many of the behaviors of non-human animals can be explained only by a certain kind of what you might term species-specific instinct. And so this notion of relational agential autonomy can capture the way in which we can't always predict what it is that these individuals are going to do, even if they mostly do some set of actions because it's kind of the thing that this kind of being does. There's times when that doesn't happen. And I'm going to give you an example now of a time. This is Sarah, chimpanzee. She passed away a couple of years ago. But she's somebody who I knew for many years. When I would go to visit her in the sanctuary, I would bring her books. This is one of those cardboard children's books. And when she gets that, she looks through it and then she eats it. It's not like she reads or anything, but she enjoys it. It's something different. It's enriching, stimulating. On this occasion, Harper, the young chimpanzee, came up and took the book from Sarah. That's not at all unusual. Young chimpanzees will take things from adult chimpanzees. It can cause a lot of commotion, but that kind of thing is a species typical, if you will, behavior. What was shocking is that Sheba here, who's happily munching her mango that I brought in the colored bag and holding her toothbrush that I also brought in the colored bag in her foot, without any sound at all, I didn't hear any sound, decided to go and get the book from Harper to disrupt her peaceful time with her gift bag, to go get the book from Harper and give it back to Sarah. I saw this and thought, wow, what is happening here? Is there some actual normativity here? Did Sheba actually believe that the book was meant for Sarah? So took it from Harper to give it back to Sarah so Sarah could ultimately look at it and then start chewing on it. I'm not sure what was happening, but I think it's a really great example of what I have in mind when I'm talking about relational agential autonomy. And so if that is a convincing example, there's many I think we can give, then I think the following argument holds. This is a picture of that very same Sheba. And basically, I think that if it is the case that some animals, at least chimpanzees for sure, but maybe other animals have relational agential autonomy, it's their relational agential autonomy that is often violated by captivity, even beyond the suffering that captivity causes. And relational agential autonomy obviously depends on having the possession of certain kinds of psychological or cognitive capacities. So beings with those capacities, like chimpanzees, and perhaps others, are frustrated when they're not able to express their relational agential autonomy, when they don't have the opportunity to do what Sheba did to get the book back from Harper and give it to Sarah, that would be a violation of their freedom. And so if there are captives who are cognitive and psychological, have the cognitive and psychological capacities to have relational agential autonomy, and they're denied the expression of that autonomy, then their intrinsic interest in liberty is frustrated, and that presents a particular kind of problem for thinking about the wrong of captivity. I want to, before I turn to thinking about what to do about captivity, which is the next part of my presentation today, I do want to mention one other kind of harm of captivity, and this is for humans. And it is a kind of harm that I'm pretty surprised at myself that I wasn't aware of until, fairly recently. And this is a harm that accrues to women who are incarcerated and who have their reproductive autonomy denied. And one of the things that I think has not been talked about enough and discussed and thought about enough is that women who are incarcerated in, let's say, their teens or early 20s, but they have long sentences, end up being unable to become mothers because their reproductive years are spent in prison. And so when they get out of prison, they may be in like premenopause or postmenopausal. And so they're unable to become mothers and to have children. Others, of course, this is more familiar, have their children taken away from them when they're incarcerated. But this is an issue that I think really raises some challenging concerns about the harms of captivity. Okay, so what do we do? How should we think about whether or not captivity is ethically permissible or ethically impermissible, given the variety of ways in which it is injurious, harmful, and concerning? Well, in the case of animals, we're in a bit of a dilemma, I think. It is a moral dilemma, as I note here, is a problem where anything you do is the wrong thing to do. If you do action X, it may be okay, but not doing action Y is not okay. So the idea is that you have moral reasons to do two things and you can't do both things, or you have moral reasons for doing one thing, but you can't do that thing. So you have to do the other thing, which isn't the best thing to do. And I think this is what captivity for animals actually brings up. So here we have some pictures of white rhinos. The first picture, the top picture, you can see, I hope, unless I'm in the way, there's some humans in the background. They're at a zoo. And so they're captive at a zoo. And part of the reason that they're captive, it's a good thing in some ways that they're captive at a zoo, even though a lot of their relational agential autonomy is impacted and violated in a zoo because they're controlled in various ways. But if they were in the wild, they're becoming extinct in the wild, and they have to be guarded by armed guards. And increasingly, these guards are being killed in wildlife poaching situations. So the problem is that we're kind of stuck in a situation in which animals may be better in captivity, which also violates their relational agential autonomy, but being, if the choice is to put them in a very volatile situation where they're possibly going to lose their life and cause great suffering in the wild, or they're in a situation in which their freedom and autonomy is being limited and violated. So it's this situation that is, I think, particularly problematic. I mean, we might think that the way to go here, and this is what I say at the bottom of the slide, is that we ought to do the best we can do when they're in captive care. But again, I think there's some really species-specific problems for that kind of solution. Elephants, for example, travel vast distances. So being captive in zoos is not really going to be a way that they can have their well-being attended to, particularly if it's a zoo in a cold climate where they might have to stay indoors for several months of the year. I think the same thing might be true of other animals that are used to warmer environments when they have to stay indoors, in cages, in cells. This is not the best kind of captive care. Similarly, there are some animals like parrots and other birds that live long lives, are very complicated beings who can't fly anymore when they're in captivity, or can only fly very short distances. And that seems to cause both suffering and autonomy frustration. also think about whales and dolphins, those kinds of animals, I think probably can't really be provided with the best care possible in entertainment facilities or aquarium. And so sanctuaries may be the best option for many of these animals. And I actually think in the case of chimpanzees, that is a terrific example, because there are great ways that they can be both stimulated and provided with the kinds of relational agential autonomy that I was illustrating in the case of Sarah and Sheba and Harper. And if the environment is right, that can work very, very well. For anybody who's interested, Chimp Haven is where Sarah and Harper and Sheba are, or Sarah was, she's passed away. There's a terrific little docu-series on Disney, Nat Geo series called Meet the Chimps. So you can find out about that particular context of captivity and whether that is bringing about the best captive care possible. I happen to think it works for the chimps, but it may not work for other animals. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, and I want to just end by talking more about some of the complications of human captivity. As I said at the beginning, there are millions of people who are incarcerated in the United States. As you see here, we incarcerate magnitudes more people than any other country in the world. There's some question about Russia because it's not clear how truthful these numbers actually are. There may be something like mass incarceration in Russia as well. The idea of mass incarceration or hyper incarceration is in part to capture this disproportionality of incarceration. And in the United States, we have mass incarceration. This is information from the Prison Policy Initiative. It's a really, really helpful source. Their information is relatively up to date. This is what they call the whole pie. They do this every year. This is the pie from last year. They noted that 2.3 million people are in 1,833 state prisons, 110 federal prisons, 1,772 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,134 local jails, 218 immigrant detention facilities, and 80 Indian country jails, as well as in military prisons and state psychiatric hospitals. So there are a variety of places where prisoners are kept, human prisoners are kept, and they're kept there for, as you can see here, a variety of purposes, or they're there for a variety of reasons. Immigration detention, very different than burglary, different again from nonviolent drug offenses and what have you. In these pandemic times, as I mentioned earlier, some states are working to reconsider the lengthy sentences that many individuals have. And in Connecticut, I'm pleased to say that the number of people who are incarcerated has been dropping considerably. I read last week that 3 prisons will be closing this year. And many incarcerated individuals, including a number of the students that I've been working with over the years, have had hearings before judges to have their sentences modified. So instead of spending 50 years in prison, they may only have to spend 25 years, only 25 years. But this is not happening nearly enough, but it is a positive sign that there is some I'm hopeful that the pie for 2021 will show us less than 2.3 million people. I just want to give a very quick look at what it was that caused mass incarceration, because I think these are really shocking and important graphics. Essentially, the idea is that we had people who were incarcerated for many, 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 many decades. And it really wasn't until the mid-1980s that the exponential growth of prisons here and here-ish began. And this was the result of both Republican and Democrat views about being tough on crime. That was what led to this sort of period of mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and the crime bill, which provided incentives to states to expand their prisons, to build more prisons, to get funds to build more prisons, but also to expand the reach of the police. 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimums, and these sorts of things all came in effect. Very lengthy sentences ensued. And primarily Black and brown people were the most impacted by this problem of mass incarceration. Should this many people be held captive? Should any people be held captive? This is a question that I think is really open to a variety of ways of thinking. I'm not going to be able to get into that discussion here, but I'm happy to talk about it during our questions and answers. I think that my view is increasingly that it is important to turn towards non-carceral options in the face of various kinds of crimes. And so just let me end by talking a little bit about some of these non-carceral options. I was quite surprised and elevated, I'd have to say, by a 2017 ACLU survey that found 61% of people, Americans, believe that if you commit a serious crime when you're on drugs or have a drug addiction, that you shouldn't be imprisoned, that you should receive treatment. 61%, that's a majority of Americans. And as it turns out, I don't know the exact numbers, but a huge proportion of people who are currently incarcerated are people who committed serious crimes that were also related to drug use and drug addiction. So I think that that's very interesting. The other thing that was interesting about the survey is that 87% believe that if you have mental health problems and you commit even a violent crime, that you should be treated by professionals as opposed to sent to prison. And there is, again, a large number of people who are currently incarcerated to whom this large percentage of non-incarcerated people think they shouldn't be incarcerated. I find that uplifting. Let me just mention 2 general ideas about non-carceral options in the case of human captives. So there's an idea about non-reformist reforms, and the idea of non-reformist reforms is important because for many people, and if you look back to the graph I showed a minute ago, we have a serious problem of too many people in the system. The system itself, because it's exponentially sort of incarcerated people, particularly Black and brown people, the system itself can't be reformed because the system, you might argue, is designed to do precisely what it's doing. So the idea of non-reformist reforms is to suggest, well, maybe there are things that could be proposed that would change the system and not support the underlying logic of the system. And so abolishing solitary confinement is one of those things. Stopping building more prisons is another one of those things. Closing prisons, like they're doing in Connecticut, is one of those things. More of the sentence modifications, hearing more of them, allowing more of them, reinstituting or liberalizing parole. In many states, including Connecticut, especially during the 90s, people were sent to prison on extraordinarily long sentences without parole being in place. And so there isn't a parole option for many people. And also, ultimately, some other of these non-reformist reforms include sentencing reform, not having mandatory minimums, and also ending the cash bail system. So many people who are trapped in the criminal system being held before trial are there because they can't afford bonds. And so they're there especially during COVID times, and they can't afford to get out. So this is, I think, a real concern. The other idea, and this is much more philosophical, but I'll end with this so that we can discuss, is to rethink the very concepts that have been taken for granted in policing and punishment. This is an idea that many abolitionists have argued for, and it is to help us really rethink, what do we mean by crime? What do we mean by punishment? What are we justified in doing to other people in our communities, in our society? How should we think about victims of crimes? Certainly there has to be some accountability, but does the victim of a crime have, say, 25 years after the crime was committed, 40 years after the crime was committed? I think these are hard questions. And ultimately, I think we talk about the quote unquote criminal justice system, but it doesn't seem that justice is really central to the system. And what would it mean to bring about a system of justice taking into account all of the harms and injuries and problems and ethical concerns that are associated with captivity? Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Laurie. That was fascinating. So we've got plenty of time for questions. You've got two options. If you have a question, if you prefer to put it in the Q&A, you can do that. Alternatively, if you want to be on camera, you can just raise your hand and I will call on you. Let's see, I have oh, okay. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, this is not so much because I want to be on camera, it's just that I don't type very well. Laurie, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. And just so you know who I am, I'm one of Simon's colleagues.
Oh, great.
In the philosophy department. I was really interested in your discussion with Peter Singer, because the way I understood what you're suggesting is that, on Singer's view, it's theoretically possible to have captivity that would pass his consequentialist test. And I'm wondering if we thought about Singer's utilitarianism in terms of maximizing preference satisfaction, if it would then capture your relational and agential
autonomy. Yeah.
Because it seems then that certainly any animal would have a preference that would fall into that kind of autonomy.
Right. So I think ultimately, just a couple of thoughts. Peter Singer doesn't believe in preference utilitarianism anymore. He's changed his view to become a hedonistic utilitarian. So that happened when he wrote a book on Sidgwick from the point of view of the universe, and now he considers himself a hedonistic utilitarian. But that's just something about Peter. So there are still preference utilitarians around, I'm sure, who I think we can raise this point about. And I think, it's a really interesting question. I think that it really largely depends on whether or not the relational agential autonomy that an individual animal might have is actually raised to the level of preference. And I think that it really is going to ultimately depend on how the preference utilitarian cashes out preference satisfaction. So I think for most preference utilitarians, that they believe that, well, at least Peter used to believe that that it's really only persons who have the kinds of preferences that should be satisfied. The reason why I was for a very long time a scholar of this, so sorry if I'm going to get really in the weeds on utilitarianism, but the idea here is that he was concerned about utilitarian, the possibility that you could end people's lives. He thinks that ending an animal's life and replacing that animal with another happy animal or a happier animal is a legitimate thing to do on a utilitarian schema, because animals don't have a preference for continued existence, because they don't have the capacity to formulate sort of desires in the way that we normally think of them. So a desire for X. So that's this conceptual autonomy. They don't have conceptual autonomy. And to form a preference, you have to have something conceptual going on. And so humans do have that capacity. And so it's not okay to kill humans who want to continue living, even if it's done painlessly, because they have a preference for continued existence. That was the argument that led to preference utilitarianism being accepted. And I think that there's still a problem with how you cash out preferences in the case of non-human animals. Relational agential autonomy is a lower form, so that you don't actually have the conceptualization of a preference. So you don't have to form a desire of the sort that says, I want, quote, that X comes to be, which would be the conceptual form of a preference. That's the mental state that I'm suggesting you don't need, even if for animals that have autonomy. So I'm lowering the bar. If preference utilitarians would lower the bar with me, then we'd be in this, I think it would be okay, but I haven't seen that, and I don't know that there would be, I think there would be issues that would make that kind of utilitarianism more complicated. Maybe even epistemologically, knowing which preferences there are would have to come into some sort of utilitarian calculus.
Thank you.
That answered it, Earl. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, we have a related question here in the Q&A. So this is from my colleague Walter, who's also a member of the philosophy department. A great talk, Laurie. Thank you. I was wondering if you could say more about how we could tell whether a given non-human animal or non-human species is capable of relational agential autonomy.
Right. And so again, I think that this is largely behavioral and observational. So if you agree with many of those who think that being able to form a kind of familiar conceptualization is beyond non-linguistic beings, that somehow language is an important sort of necessary condition for conceptualization, then we can't think of them as having that capacity, obviously. We just might be wrong about what conceptualization is, what it means, but to be fair to theorists who have that higher standard, I wanted to suggest that there's all sorts of behaviors one can observe in non-human animals that go beyond species typical behaviors in this set. So if you look at a pack of wolves, or you look at a group of chimpanzees, or you watch an octopus, and for octopus's teacher is all the rave now, there's going to be different behaviors between each of these individuals. And so something's going on that is different. They're not programmed. If they were programmed, they would all be programmed to do the same thing, but they do a whole bunch of different things. And when you observe them doing all of these different things, you have to think there's some process in their minds that are making this chimp do this and this chimp do something completely different. This bird do one thing, this bird do another thing. And so that's partly a way, the relational agential autonomy is a way of explaining that individual variation that suggests that there's some way, it's sort of in a way too, I think of it, the autonomy part as, this is what we would normally think of about autonomy. I'm free to, I'm free to sort of develop certain kinds of preferences and likes and habits and behaviors. And that makes me autonomous. And I'm going to act in those ways, in certain ways that you might not be able to predict all the time, because I have that freedom, I have that autonomy. And I think the same thing applies to many, many other species. So that's sort of what I had in mind when I was trying to, I think that philosophically, the notion of autonomy serves a really important role in identifying a certain kind of value to humans and humanity, but really makes the bar far too high when it comes to some humans with different abilities, disabilities of various sorts, and also all sorts of non-human animals.
Okay. I mean, I was wondering if I could maybe follow up on that a little bit. I mean, like in discussions animal welfare at the moment, there seems to be increasing interest in taking account of things like cultural capacities in animals. You know, so chimpanzees have cultures and ways of doing things, and like in your example with Sarah and her companions, it seemed like there was something like a social norm or something there that was being violated, and her companion returned the book to her. How does that kind of figure into your account? You know, is that necessary for relational agential autonomy, or is that something that might just go along with it or be an indicator of it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Simon. I think that the idea here is that it's precisely that they have relational agential autonomy that allows these cultural variations to occur, and helps us to recognize, so that we recognize these cultural variations. And I'm thinking of in communities where, there's different ways of opening nuts. Some of the communities of chimps in one area will use hammers on an anvil, and others will use dropping things on the nuts. And these are just ways that they do it. It doesn't make any sense to think of and explain those divergences in behaviors as being somehow a feature of some sort of hardwiring or evolutionary programming. And culture does exist amongst all sorts of different creatures, and noticing that diversity and that divergence, I think, again, supports this idea of a relational agential autonomy. Because otherwise, what are they doing? Well, they're learning from each other, and that's been established. They're passing on their cultures, but they're also, in whales, they've been talking about, there's different ways. Whale song has been studied, and different communities of whales change the songs in very different ways. I don't know enough about music to comment beyond that. But that's, I think, exactly what I have in mind, that we see in all these different domains a great diversity of behavior, such that if we were going to say what is typical behavior, we would really be at a loss to explain it. And so this goes beyond that. There's typical behaviors that we could talk about, walking many, many, many miles, or being hierarchically organized, or being matriarchal. These are species typical behaviors, or ways of describing what's going on with these animals. But there's this individual variations that they're deciding to do something that way as opposed to this other way. That's the kind of autonomy I'm trying to capture in relational agential autonomy.
Great, thank you. All right, so another question we have here. So I'm interested to hear your opinion on smaller scale captivity in terms of people keeping pets like hamsters, for example, or even more exotic pets that naturally exist in other places in the world that people keep as pets.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And in the Ethics of Captivity volume, I made sure that there's a chapter on dogs that Alexandra Horowitz wrote. She's a cognitive scientist who does work with dogs. And I also have one on cats, and whether or not it's okay to keep them in or let them out. I think the question of companion animals is a really complicated question. They are captives. And if you think back to the definition that I was giving of captivity, at least the conceptual definition that I'm thinking about, that they're under our control and they rely on us to satisfy their basic needs. That's certainly true with our companion animals and our pets. We tell them what to eat. We tell them when they can go out. We tell them where they can be, where they can't be, who they can be with. They really are sort of canonical captives. People don't like hearing that. I think that's interesting that they don't like hearing it, because that means there's something wrong with captivity, which is, I think, the ethical challenge I'm posing. But I think the idea is that even when you love another, you can recognize that there is still potentially something troubling about them being captive. If I can give you a little personal example, it's just happened this week. My sister and her husband live in Arizona, and my sister's husband there was a cat at his workplace, and a wild cat outside of his workplace, and the company doesn't want the cats there. And so he decided he was going to trap the cat and get the cat vaccinated and bring the cat home. They have 3 other cats. So they brought the cat home. They bought this really big, fancy, like what they call a catio, which is a big kind of outdoor space with little places to go. And they put the cat in there, and the cat is hissing and growling and trying to get out of the enclosure. And my sister said to me, this was just a couple of days ago, she said, I don't think this cat likes me. And so I had to say, well, this cat was free and now is in captivity. And that's horrifying. And so I think I think, we don't often think she doesn't let her other cats out of the house, but I don't think she thinks of the cats as being captives. And so she was really surprised, with all the good intentions and love and desire to save and nurture this cat, that the cat herself doesn't really feel good about being in the catio. The fancy, expensive catio isn't quite doing it yet. I mean, hopefully the hope is it'll change. But the important point here is that that's captivity. It's pretty obviously captivity. And even though in this case, this cat is better off in captivity, that's another feature of it. There is, I think, a concern about at least being cognizant of the fact that our companion animals, as much as we might love them, are still captives.
Right.
The question of the exotic pets, I think, is just a really hard. I think, there's been a lot of really important thinking about the ethics of pet keeping, but exotic pets, I think, is a really dangerous avenue to go down.
You mean in terms of just having them, it is dangerous?
I think it is dangerous. I mean, it depends on, what I'm thinking of is parrots. So parrots live for a very long time. They can live up to 80 years. They bond with individuals. They don't like captivity. They're very difficult to take care of. There's an illegal trade in the exotic species of parrots. There's so many sanctuaries that have way too many parrots because people decide they can't take care of them. So that's sort of those are a whole set of ethical problems that go beyond captivity with those animals.
Sure. Okay, great. So another question we have here. So Laurie, you mentioned abolition/abolitionists in regards to the prison system. Do you have methods or arguments that you could suggest when in conversation with people who are focused on prison reform and working on policies? I'm especially thinking in terms of people who don't understand an abolitionist perspective. Thank you so much for this lecture and your time.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about abolition. I'm writing a paper at the moment on abolition. I think that what's really important to understand is that initially when so abolition, okay, I'll not go in the weeds. Abolition has a long and robust history. I was just reading a beautiful piece that was written by Quaker woman in 1976 and a team of others so before mass incarceration, who was arguing for the abolishment of prisons. There's a brand new handbook out on penal abolition internationally. So there's a variety of different perspectives on abolition. I think the first thing that people misunderstand right away is this idea that somehow we're going to open the prisons and everybody's going to just be free. I've never encountered an abolitionist who had that view. I think that the idea is more that there are, as I was suggesting at the end of the talk, that there are a variety of ways of thinking about non-reformist reforms, and also to rethink the conceptual tools that we work with when we're thinking about crime and punishment. Philosophically speaking, if you look at what's been done philosophically on theories of punishment, I have yet to find a discussion of what we are justified in doing to others when they sort of violate social norms or violate laws. I mean, if you go back to thinking, if you go back to Locke, the whole idea of punishment in Locke was something that we sort of all have an individual right to decide on. But it's so inconvenient if we were all to do that, that we sort of create a government structure that deals with it for us. But nowhere is there any discussion about what would be justified or not justified in that. I mean, you get a discussion. I just haven't seen it. If anybody knows of one, I'd love to know. I've been looking a lot, not about theories of punishment, about what punishment, what justifies punishment. There's lots of that, but rather, are we justified in taking someone else's freedom for the rest of their life if they take somebody's life? Why are we justified? How are we justified? That's I think, a really hard question. And abolitionists have us thinking about those questions. Abolitionists have us thinking about alternative ways of imagining what's possible to do in those contexts.
Okay, thank you.
Feel free to follow up. I don't know that I had a lot of thoughts in my head, so.
Yeah. Question here, can you talk about speciesism and and contemporary approaches that challenge that, such as post-humanist, feminist approaches, environmental holistic approaches, and where do you stand with respect to those?
So I think speciesism is so let me just make sure that I'm understanding, which I think I am, the question, and that everybody else does. So speciesism is a term that Richard Ryder and Peter Singer popularized as a way of thinking about being prejudicial against other species in the way that sort of patriarchal attitudes are prejudicial towards those who are categorized as women, and racial prejudice operates. So speciesism is thought of as the same kind of prejudicial attitude that we see. I think the critique, at least one of the critiques that I'm very open to, is that that way of understanding sexism, or that way of understanding racism, and thus that way of understanding speciesism, misses an important way in which these oppositions or these dualisms or these hierarchies get formulated. And so for me, I don't actually, I mean, it's hard to say this, because I do think people are more anti-Black than they are anti-animal. And so I think there isn't a parallel between the structures of anti-Blackness and the structures of anti-animality. However, the animal has always been other than the human, and the human has never been a unified category or a biological category. And so I think that speciesism buys into a way of thinking about the organization of relations, social relations, that is probably flawed. That's what I think of speciesism. But the question about sort of post-humanism or new feminist materialisms, that I think those just flatten everything out. So I'm not in favor of thinking about the sort of what, you might think that, Ingrid Newkirk, the founder of PETA, said at one point, a rat is a cat is a mouse, or a rat is a cat as a dog is a boy. And the idea was that these are all organisms. And I think what she was trying to do was say that we're as wrong to hurt a child as we are to hurt an animal. But I think that some of the post-humanist literature actually believes that everything is on the same plane, from like the fungus is the fungus and the ocean and the mountains and the rabbits and everything is the same. And I think that's too flat of an ontology. So I'm somewhere in between, flattening this all out, having everything sort of be at the same value level, and buying into a value dualism.
Okay. I was recently reading Entangled Empathy, and I particularly like your kind of critique of some of the standard approaches in animal ethics that focus on similarity as the standard by which to, similarity to humans, I mean, as the standard by which to judge the ethical considerability of animals. So are you saying there's something kind of similar applying there and to this other kind of family of theories?
Yeah, and I think in Entangled Empathy, I also do talk about this critique of like sort of thinking about sort of the way so the entanglement in Entangled Empathy is indeed this notion that we're interconnected in all sorts of ways. But I still think that, there are important distinctions between being the way I say it is beings that it's something that it's like to be like versus stuff. And that's one of the ways in which I still think that there's an important difference between stuff, mountains, oceans, microbiome, and what it's like to be the thing that is trying to get out of the cage, or taking the book back from the other, or pacing, or engaged in some sort of distress, right? I think those are different.
Okay. So another question about domestic animals, domestic pets. So by the definition you gave for captivity, pets would seem to be included. That type of captivity might satisfy the utilitarian argument for captivity without suffering, but on the Kantian view that advocates for autonomy, I think that argues for that having pets is morally wrong because they wouldn't have autonomy in that situation. Is that correct?
So I think, there's a variety of views that have been expressed about this. I think that my view is that they are captives. My view is also that we are in a moral dilemma site toward a situation in terms of captive animals. And what I believe is justifiable ultimately is to provide the best captive care one can. But again, recognizing that these beings are captives, not denying that they're captives. And it raises a whole host of other sort of subsidiary ethical questions, like whether you let your cats out or don't let them out. If they kill birds, then you're creating a sort of a cycle of harm and destruction. If you don't let them out, you're frustrating a set of their interests and violating their relational agential autonomy. So there's a lot of difficulty around our relationships with other animals. Ultimately, we have to train them. And we have to train them to behave in human worlds. So that already is a kind of violation of their autonomy. But what's the alternative? I think that's part of the dilemma. With chimpanzees, people are often saying, well, why are you excited about them going into just another different captive situation? Why shouldn't they just go back to the wild? And I think, well, back to the wild means probably death. And so it's a hard decision. Do you keep them in captivity, which is a wrong? Or do you put them in a situation where they're bound to die, which is a wrong? Well, these are hard decisions to make. I don't think ignoring them, which is the problem that I felt like Singer was saying. Oh no, if you make it not suffering captivity, then there's no problem, and you can't let them go in the wild because that's going to lead to harm. So but I still think there is a moral remainder, as it were. The wrong of captivity remains. We shouldn't pretend, oh, we're doing the best we can by these animals, so we're all good. This is a way of sort of, again, flattening or ignoring the complexity of our moral experiences and our moral lives. And I think it's important to think about the ways in which ethical concerns impact us at various places. There's not easy answers in our relationships that are not just our relationships, but our institutions that are fraught with disvalue, fraught, so they're fraught with problems, let's say. Yeah.
And of course, with chimpanzees, a lot of their autonomy is going to involve violence towards each other too, since that's a
exactly
fairly ubiquitous part of their social lives. And I mean, do you have a view on how that kind of figures in? That some chimpanzee cultures are not violent.
Right. Well, I mean, you raise a series of really important, you in my mind, it's like, oh, this raises a series of really important problems because, the animals in the wild, this isn't a site free from suffering in any way, shape, or form. There's a nice and interesting and important area of ethical research on sort of wild animal suffering and how to think about that in the overall scheme of things. Chimpanzees in particular, and usually it's in captivity, but sometimes it's in the wild as well. Their chimpanzees will kill each other, hurt each other, bite each other's digits off. They're violent and hierarchical, and that's their species typical behavior. There are some alphas that aren't violent. There are some alphas that are very violent, and they also, as you say, part of their social world is to act violently so they can reconcile. It's part of what keeps their social cohesion happening and keeps their hierarchies in place. So suffering is a part of what it means to be a chimpanzee. So it's kind of hard to think about, if what you're interested in is minimizing suffering, what would that do to chimpanzee behavior? Or what would that do to, like, should the world become, policed by utilitarians trying to minimize suffering? That would, I think, be a strange world.
Okay. All right. So Tamba has a question. Tamba, you should be able to talk.
Muted.
You have to unmute yourself, Tamba.
Yes.
There you go.
Yes, I just unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, Lori, great talk. My question is, I'm one of Simon's colleagues there. My question is, does your position, or at least since we started here, it appears to me as if you all assume anthropocentric position. Would that make any difference if we assumed a non-anthropocentric position in addressing these issues?
So I would, in other writing that I've done, I make a distinction between what I call inevitable anthropocentrism and for lack of a better term, arrogant anthropocentrism. And I think that the inevitability of the anthropocentrism is important. I am speaking as a human with a human perspective. I'm not really going to be able to speak as a chimpanzee, even though I know a lot about chimpanzees. I don't think it's appropriate, and I think it would actually be appropriative to speak as if I could from the perspective of a chimpanzee. Having said that, though, I do think that I don't accept a kind of arrogant anthropocentrism. And part of what I'm trying to do in talking about captivity is to highlight the ways in which humans have put animals in very, very complicated situations that cause a variety of injuries and harms, and that we need to attend to that variety of injuries and harms. And not all of those injuries and harms, or wrongs, if you will, are suffering. There's further problems with captivity. So in that sense, I don't see myself as being anthropocentric other than the inevitable anthropocentrism. But I'm certainly willing to hear specifically if you think I'm being anthropocentric in a specific way.
That's a good question there. Since, at least from what I heard today, I didn't hear you speak from that arrogant anthropocentrism, but I'm still interested in knowing whether it would make a huge difference if people approach all these issues of the ethics of captivity from a non-anthropocentric position.
I guess I just don't know what a non-anthropocentric position is.
Okay.
I think that's the problem.
Okay. So let's say, do we, as humans, should we always assume we have the right to speak for all the other species?
Right. That's partly why I don't want to speak for the other species. I just want to speak for our species. Our species has done a huge, and we've created concepts, we've created theories, we've created practices, we've created structures, we've created institutions that have denied and exploited and harmed so many others, that I'm speaking about one aspect of that, which is the ethics of captivity, and thinking about, is there a way to rethink some of the wrongs and harms that we've done in that area? And it is the anthropos that have done that. It's the humans who have done that. So I'm critical of them. I'm critical of us in our doing that, and urging that we think differently about it. Now, I suppose one thing that you might think is, why don't we just say no interference? Just let's stop. Like, don't even talk about it. Just stop doing all of it. But I think that we've gone too far. There's really no place. There's no place where there are animals that are free from our interventions. And so I think in that sense, that would be to some extent, a dereliction of our ethical responsibilities.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have a follow-up on Tamba's question in the Q&A. This is from Amy. Could we derive values from behavior? For example, chimpanzee and bonobo behavior quite different. Would different rules apply to each?
I think it is true that there are different norms that are operating, different norms that operate in different species, and different norms that operate, as we talked about, different cultural norms maybe, that operate in different groups of animals for the same species. I think there's a lot of really important and interesting questions that we can ask about what are those norms, what do these what do these individuals make of those norms? I worked a little bit with Kristen Andrews on a piece on empathy and other apes when we started asking some of these questions about the norm governing behaviors of different communities of animals, particularly orangutans and chimpanzees. I think that's the answer to the question. I'm not 100% sure if that was an answer to that question, but I do think that there are really interesting ways of thinking about how and whether, and that was partly why I gave you the example of Sarah and Sheba and Harper. It's an anecdotal event. It was a really shocking event. We were all surprised. People who have spent their lives observing chimpanzees' behaviors have never seen this. I talk about this in the beginning, or friends talk about this at the beginning of Untangled Empathy. There's another chimpanzee who's a dear friend of mine named Emma, who I have a very kind of, I don't even know how to explain the relationship. But at one point I was leaving Chimphaven, where she lives now, and she gathered a bunch of flowers or weed-like things in her enclosure and handed me a bouquet. And nobody had ever seen anything like this ever. So these are the kinds of things, it's like, wow, what is happening? And I don't think, because they're not replicable, because you can't study them in a way that we're used to studying the behavior of other animals, it's hard to think about what might be going on, what the conceptualization is. And I think when Sheba and Sarah and Harper's little exchange happened, it really did make me wonder, does she, as you were saying, Simon, too, does Sheba think that this book belongs to Sarah? It's like a norm was violated. How you can ever know that, I don't know, because it's very difficult to imagine how one would even replicate a study that would allow for that to be determined.
Just as a side, I've heard Sarah Brosnan report a very kind of similar anecdote about a dispute over food, where one of the alpha females actually returned a piece of food to another female who had been stolen from, and that's even more remarkable because it involves
food. Right, exactly. Right. So, I mean, I guess that's what these anecdotes have to add up to something at some point. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Laurie. That was really fascinating.
Thanks for having me. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. It was nice to see you.
This is a time when we'd normally say, let's all go off to dinner now and talk some more about it. Unfortunately, we can't do that, but hopefully we can have you back again at some point in the future. That would be great.
That would be lovely. That would be lovely. Thank you all for really good questions.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. So yeah, thank you all. Take care. Have a good weekend, everybody.